Hey YouTube. Testing. Somebody logs on. Could they give me a sound check? Thank you, Laura. How's Laura doing today? Um, I kind of have the inklings of a topic to talk about. Um, I'm more than welcome to have have people bring up other topics and we can talk about those. But I broached the subject of um, archaeoichthyology last week, and I think it's an interesting topic because it leads into the topic of fish keeping itself. And the history of fish keeping is an interesting thing to go through. It's got some really interesting twists and turns if you get deep down into the history of fish keeping. And the topic that I wanted to tie this all up with today is what kind of habits as fish keepers have we developed? What kind of methodologies do we cleave to? I've been watching Haley, Oddball Aquatics, with her rope fish pond that she's been developing lately, and and she's very much a proponent of Lucas's um, methodology, and I find it very interesting that Lucas's methodology was basically developed in let's see 1850 is when fish keeping pretty much arrived in England and Europe, and up until then the fish were kept pretty primitively, and by that they mean basically just in whatever kind of container the fish keepers were using, and it was basically just um, a container holding water. But based on the works of uh, chemist Priestley and a zoologist named Johnson, who realized the plant oxygen relationship, um, fish keeping really began to enter the modern age. And Robert Warrington was the builder of the first actual aquarium. And I'm quoting from Algon for Healthy Aquariums here. Um, his theory was by building a glass structure filled with sand on the bottom, snails and plants that can provide oxygen, fish can live forever. The plants would provide oxygen to the fish, snails eat the decaying plants and lay eggs, and the fish feed off of the snail eggs. The perfect contained cycle. And that's pretty much what Lucas is doing in his fish room. And I find that a very interesting, um, that in the 1850s, people were doing what Lucas is doing now because basically that's the only way they knew to keep fish, the only way that they understood how everything worked together and how it all combined to make an environment that allowed fish keeping to happen. And this article that I'm reading and looking at um, basically states that Aristotle was one of the first um, scientifically minded people that started trying to develop the science of ichthyology by describing local fish, by describing their habits, by describing the trade that went on with fish and fish sauce. Um, one of the very early trade items that was going on around the world, and and I say early, and by this I mean late into the Iron Age, um, was fish sauce. A lot of people really loved certain types of fish sauce to eat with their food, and so mostly in the very earliest forms of Homo sapiens' relationship with fish, it was as a food item or as a flavoring item. And it slowly developed into a science, the actual cataloging of different kinds of fish. And then it started in the, I think that this article quotes a turbofish, welcome to the stream. I think this article quotes 960. Hey Haley, I was just talking about you. Talking about the fact that the methodology that Lucas uses was pretty much developed in 1850, that the first builders of fish tanks and some scientists, a zoologist and a chemist basically, developed the idea that a tank with plants and snails and fish could run forever. Hey Cobweb Caverns, welcome to the stream. No, I'm not so much a pretty lady. As you can see, I followed Bear's suit, and I got my ears lowered too. So I'm running on a much shortened hair schedule now. I did manage to keep a rat tail, although my wife says that it's a mullet that's been braided. So I'm sporting a mullet now. Yeah. So in 960, a Chinese emperor started the habit, and that at that time it was basically a habit of breeding goldfish. Goldfish are one of the first recorded fish that were bred and kept in captivity, and mostly they were keeping them in ponds, but I think they had some containers that they used for keeping fish too. And so at that time it was for the emperor's pleasure. But as time went on, they started, it became popular with the common folk, and common people all had fish ponds and were breeding goldfish as well. And that's where we get all of our koi lines and all of the different types of goldfish that there are, was from breeding these fish that the emperor loved to keep. And that's really the first recorded, and we have no idea unrecorded stuff. Cobweb Caverns says I may be a little drunk following a day out with friends in the steampunk society, so ask me anything. So as things progressed, the keeping of koi and goldfish spread through Japan and other parts of Asia, and then finally in the 1800s, or let me check on this article. 1691, the goldfish made its appearance in Portugal, Europe, and from there it arrived in England in 1728. And at the time, the fish was popular throughout Europe's privileged ruling class. And Holland was the first country to breed the goldfish in Europe in 1780. So basically, in the late 1700s, through the middle 1850s. Um, it also states that the very first fish book was Essays about the Goldfish, written in China in 1596. And of course, that's what we have surviving. That's the information that we have surviving down through the ages. You know, if it wasn't recorded, if no one wrote about it in such a way that it stayed in the common knowledge and literature, then we don't really have an idea. Hey, Valley Fish, welcome to the stream. So about 1850, we start getting the actual hobby of keeping fish, and it grew rapidly as the methods of transporting fish grew, i.e., steamships being quicker across the oceans, airplanes. When airplane technology first became widely used, it was easier to get fish from the wild where they were collected, you know, because basically back then they just collected them in large oil tins and sometimes in 55-gallon drums as well. They basically rinse them out, fill them with the local water, and dump the fish in and seal them up and load them aboard an airplane or a steamship. And they would be transported in that method all the way to wherever they were going. And they didn't get a lot of survival. The survival rates were not good. The people were lucky to get a pair out of a whole drum or a whole, you know, they eventually started using the oil tins, which I'd say are probably 7 or 8 gallons, to ship them in also. You know, they were big rectangular tin boxes made for shipping cooking oil into a country or out of a country. And Haley wants to know, the question is, when did corporations figure out they could profit off of us by telling us we need filters and cartridges and fake clams that bubble? Okay, the only bit that I have in this little article that I've been reading is let's see, in 1856, a groundbreaking essay, Sea in a Glass, by Emil Adolf Rombamabler, was published in Germany, which is recognized as the beginning of the aquatic hobby as we know it today. The term aquarium, by the way, was used in writings as early as 1841. But in 1952, Dr. Banish Atlas, revolutionized the hobby by inventing flake food. Up until that point, all fish kept in captivity were fed live foods. And the first filtration that this article lists, and I don't know if it's perfect or not, took many years to understand filtration. One of the first, the undergravel filter, was introduced in the 1950s. So it basically, everything got spinning in the 1950s. In the 1950s, filtration started to be developed. Companies were making them, to answer Haley's question. And undergravel filters were made in the 50s. And the development of flake food is probably the real beginning of corporations selling us something that we need and telling us that we can't live without it and that our fish can't live without it. And Cobweb Caverns says that 1980s. And I've been experiencing the fish keeping hobby pretty solidly straight through since the 70s. And I would argue that about 72 or 73, suddenly things took off in ways that we had never really seen before. Companies were starting to make new kinds of equipment. All kinds of canister filters were starting to be developed and sold. Um, Lots of different methodologies were tried. The way electric heaters were being manufactured and sold started to change a great deal. You get companies like Hagen and 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 bigger companies starting to really. Hey Joseph, welcome to the stream, man. Um, so, oh, I'm doing good, Joseph. How are things on the island? Um, what I would like to talk about as a tie together for all this information that I've deposited here about dates and things like that is Cobweb says he's in the UK, so probably a few years behind the changes in the US. Uh, Cobwebs, I'm not so sure that the changes are really uh, that far apart. What I think is when we were really starting to expand our search as fish keepers for different ways to solve problems that we were experiencing. You know, we were experiencing problems in the 70s. Well, people had been experiencing those problems far before we did and had gone to great lengths to figure out ways to solve those problems in fish keeping. And so, what I would like to posit as a theory about this topic that I'm talking about is that we are a product of when we really started learning a lot about fish keeping as fish keepers. That when we really had that epiphany, that aha moment about how incredible this hobby is and how much science and how much pleasure and how much pain there is involved with it. When we had that epiphany, that is when we started really expanding our searching for answers to problems into the available literature, the available periodicals, the available companies, the available products. So, so we as fish keepers had a time period where we really started cutting our teeth on fish keeping and fish keeping equipment and fish keeping advice from people that we met and brushed shoulders with in the hobby, that we met at conventions, that we got mimeograph sheets of material from, that we went to seminars about this company's new dechlor or this company's new filter, because back in the day that's what a lot of clubs did. They brought in people, highlights in the hobby, like Wayne Liebel. My first experience with Wayne Liebel was as a salesperson for what was the name of that dechlor? Aqua Shell, something. He worked for a dechlorinating company that made a really common dechlor back in the day. I'm surprised I can't remember the name of it. No. Um, and that's my first experience. Cobweb says, I remember my father keeping a tank in the late 70s, the early 80s. Was always angels and neons heavily planted. I seem to recall things changing mid to late 80s with new filters, etc. Okay, so what I'm trying to get at, Cobweb, is not when this stuff was developed, but when we as fish keepers glommed on to all of it, when we suddenly understood what it is that we needed to try to find to to make our fish keeping better. We had reached the point where we were actually able to keep fish alive and to keep them thriving, but we would run into problems, and so we would reach out to the fish keeping community. We would reach out to the periodicals and the, like I said, mimeograph sheets back in the 70s that were passed around, and we would reach out as far as companies bringing in speakers to talk about their products that we all respected as people in the hobby, and we would go out to see them. Sometimes clubs brought them in, sometimes the companies would just bring someone in to give talks, but usually it was related to a club. You know, I'm not sure what the club got out of it, but as conventions began to get bigger and larger, then these corporations began to spend more money at these events because that's where the fish keepers were gathered. And you begin to get a whole plethora of new ideas and mixing with the old ideas. And depending on when we as fish keepers really reached the point where we were starting to absorb what was being put out and trying different things, that is how our fish keeping ideas get set. Haley was teasing me, I think it was on her stream, about giving up all of our filtration methods and just doing like Lucas does and using all natural ecosystem that we talked about was developed by a chemist and a zoologist very early on in fish keeping, really before aquariums. Bugatok says, stop live streaming, you're too young. I don't think I'm too young, Booga. I'm not sure if you're trolling or just offering opinions, but I'm not too young. I'm too old, if anything. But my point being that I am reluctant to give up those things that I learned as methodology to do the keeping my fish thriving. I learned in the 70s things that really helped my fish keeping. So I'm reluctant to give those things up. And here we are in the 2020s almost, and I'm still reluctant to give up those things that I've learned over the years. And Cobweb Cavern says, for me, and I guess a few others, it was only when the internet became usable in the early 2000s that I knew deeper insight into the hobby. Up to that point, my info came from the live fish store, and that's true. The live fish store was trying to sell us fish, was trying to sell us whatever new fangled creation that they had bought into and trying to sell it to us, and we all bought tons of that and still continue to buy tons of things because it looks like it would work perfectly to solve an issue, you know. Haley is saying that she's reluctant to give up her filters because she's already achieved balance in the tanks that have them, and it's all about balance. Yes, but balance can be all kinds of different things. please don't misconstrue the statements that I am making when I say things like, you'll get my canister wave makers and sumps out of my cold dead hands. You know, it's not that I am naysaying Lucas's methodology. Lucas's methodology is much older than my methodology. He just came to it through experimentation on his own, and it's really working for him. And so he has mastered that. In the year 2060, someone's going to come up with some new methodology, and Lucas is going to be the 50-year-old or the 60-year-old that says, no, I'm not giving up my methodology just because you come up with some utterly different newfangled methodology for keeping them. You know, it's what we learn through the hobby in the period of time when we really hit our stride, when we really have a great deal of information that we are bringing in suddenly from news sources, be that the internet, be that email, be that BBS systems, be it periodicals, magazines, and periodicals that are published by companies, be that from our live fish store, be that from clubs, club meetings, club events, major conferences, companies bringing in speakers to talk about some area that they are really concerned with because they're selling a product. All of this stuff goes together to create habits within us as fish keepers. And when you create a habit that works really well for you, regardless of whether it's possible for anyone else to make that same habit for themselves, maybe you've figured out some really intricate way that you can make your fish thrive and breed, and because of that you have developed a methodology and it becomes a habit. That is your habit of how you do things. It's your habit of how you change water. It's your habit of how you feed. It's your habit of the processes that you go through to try to get your fish to breed. All of these different areas of our fish keeping hobby develop into habits in us as fish keepers. And we are loath to give up habits that we have really gotten accustomed to. The way we do a water change, the steps we go through, the disinfecting of fish nets, the disinfecting of the technology that we're using to change water. All of these things become ingrained in our fish keeping methodology, and they become habits for us. And when we developed methodologies that became habits, says a whole lot about the types of fish keeping methodologies that we use. When I first started trying to cure fish of illnesses that I had kept long enough for them to develop real illnesses and maladies, and before I understood quarantining, and I would snag a spur of the moment purchase and bring it home and drop it in one of my tanks, and all the fish in the tank would get sick. Suddenly I had ick, suddenly I had velvet, suddenly I had something that I had to get rid of. My methodologies are very much still in that 1970s, where mainly all the chemicals that we had at our disposal were poisonous dyes, and were just as dangerous to the fish as they were to the malady that they were supposed to be curing. And so I am loath to go straight to chemicals, whereas someone like Corey at Aquarium Co-op, who has a business where he has to try to keep the biggest portion of his fish stock that he brings in alive, he immediately goes to the chemicals that he understands work best in conjunction with each other and form a prophylactic, for lack of a better word, to kill almost all the diseases that he thinks these fish might be suffering from. His puffer that he loved, Hank, died from a. Thanks for stopping by, Haley. I'm really enjoying your rope fish stream that you're on here lately. Um, Corey has developed a habit, and it is a good habit for business sense, for the types of fish that he's getting shipped into his business, and it has trickled down into his hobby, his fish keeping. He uses 3 or 4 chemicals when he first gets the fish. There is no stick them in a tank and watch them for a month and see what happens. He immediately hits them with that chemical bath. And he has a good survival rate. He had the experience of his puffer Hank dying from a parasite that it brought in from the wild that lived in it the entire time he had it until it killed him. And of course, there are other factors involved with that. Stress will allow something that a fish has been carrying forever to suddenly take over and kill it. So Hank may have gone through some kind of stress that created a situation, or maybe his health deteriorated naturally, that created a situation where that parasite that had been in Hank's body his whole life from the wild suddenly was able to gain the upper hand and kill Hank, regardless of whatever Corey tried to do, no matter how expensive he was willing to go, no matter what chemicals he was willing to use, that parasite took over and killed Hank. And we can all sympathize with that feeling. And so that experience, the experience of being a business operator that ships in fish on a regular basis and needs to be able to do a quick, safe turnaround with those fish in 30 days, in 20 days, he needs to be able to turn those fish around, put them up for sale, and be relatively assured that his customers are not going to get an infected fish. And Cobweb says it's sad to watch the stream of Corey talking about Hank. He breaks down and clearly had a lot of love for that pupper. I couldn't agree with that more. That was a seminal moment in Corey's fish keeping life, to understand that no matter how much he cared, no matter how much he was willing to spend, no matter what lengths he was willing to go to, nothing was going to save Hank. And it's a moment we all face as fish keepers. And it has a great deal to do. It has a great effect. I mean, how could it not have a great effect? You fall in love with a fish. It's no longer just a fish that you watch in the tank. This is a pet, just like a dog or a cat that you would bring in and fall in love with. This is a member of your family, and you are helpless to save it in some situation. Well, what that does is that changes how you look at medication. When Corey gets a puffer in now, he understands that that puffer is probably so invaded with parasites that he needs to treat over and over again for parasites, to do double, triple, quadruple duty to try to get those parasites as much out of that fish as he possibly can. But that is not the methodology that I learned. I learned to distrust medication, to recognize that water quality was more likely to do good things for my fish, because if the water quality is causing them stress, then they can actually fight off a lot of problems if you just make sure that the water quality is right. Now, that's not to say that changing water will cure all maladies, because it won't. Sometimes the fish become so overrun with things like ick, you're not going to change enough water to get ick out of a tank. You're going to have to use some kind of medication or some kind of treatment. You know, you can cure ick by having 7 tanks that are all set up in a row and ready for the fish to go into, and to drop that fish in the first tank on the first day, and exactly 24 hours later pull that fish out of the first tank and drop it in the second tank, and exactly 24 hours later pull that fish out of the second tank and put it in the third tank. You can literally cure ick by running a fish through a 2-week cycle of being in a new tank each day, and you can just use the same 7 tanks. And if you think about this, what's going on is that ick has several cycles in its life, and one of those cycles is a free swimming stage that, unless it reinfects another fish or the same fish in 3 days' time, depending on the temperature, and you can speed that life cycle up by raising the temperature, but depending on the temperature, that free swimming stage of ick will perish if it can't reinfect a fish within 3 days. So by using 7 tanks and going through the 7 and then starting back at the first for the second week and doing the same thing each time, the free swimming stage of ick dies in every one of those 7 tanks before the fish is put back in that tank again. And so there are no free swimming stage ick to reinfect the fish. And so after a period of 2 weeks, there will be no ick left alive, because the ick that had infected the fish originally will have passed through its cycle completely, and all of the free swimming stages of ick will also have died in those 7 tanks before there was ever a fish to be put back in. And this is the way you can start to think about methodologies in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and methodologies in the 2020s. There are a lot of different ways to look at the same problem, and many of them involve understanding the malady that is affecting your fish, whether it is a parasite, whether it is a virus, whether it is some other malady, and what the life cycle of that malady is. People will tell you that when they get ick in one of their tanks, they raise the temperature to 84 degrees and they dose the tank heavily with salt. Well, basically what they're doing when they raise that temperature so high in that tank is they are shortening the time period that it can reinfect a fish, that the free swimming stage of ick can reinfect that fish or other fish in that tank. Then by adding the salt, they are creating an osmotic situation where the fish can expel the stages of ick out of their bodies and off of their bodies much easier. And it is harder for ick to survive in that highly salty, high temperature environment, and it dies out. It literally just can't reinfect. So that's two different ways to cure just ick that come from different time periods in the fish keeping hobby. Now we have all kinds of chemicals that we can add, and they are using other methodologies to change the life cycle, to make it harder for the fish to be infected. They are using basic understanding of ick as a malady that go back into the 60s, but they are just attacking it in a different way. And we develop our habits of how to handle those kinds of problems at the point where we become aware fish keepers, at the point where our hobby steps up a notch and we become fish keepers that are able to really advance in the hobby by gaining new information. And it's very, very incrementally and very, very slowly that we are willing to give up those ideologies that we understood back then worked for us. Now, new people coming into the hobby, they are going to be faced with the massive array of different ways to do things right now in this world, in this fish keeping age, and they will develop their own methodology. Now, some people like Lucas have gone back to pre-fish keeping methodologies that also work. It doesn't mean that any one of these methodologies works better or less well than the others. It just means either through the process of experimentation and recognizing what works for us, or the process of learning fish keeping and the time and age when we learned our fish keeping chops. That's how we developed our habits. And it's possible to develop fish keeping habits in a lot of different ways. And it's possible to slowly modify those habits as new technologies are developed. I've got just as many chemicals as Corey does. Obviously not just as many, because Corey runs a business and has lots of them at his disposal. But I've got just as many chemicals as Corey does, but I am just basically intrinsically loath to use those chemicals as a first line of response. I'm always going to want to do heavy water changes. Then I'm going to do things like some of the different chemicals that cause fish to slough off their slime coat and develop a new slime coat, because in doing that, a lot of times the offending malady will be sloughed off when the fish slough off the slime coat. I'm going to want to feed them garlic as opposed to erythromycin or, some heavy chemical. And that is a negative in a lot of ways. A lot of times I lose fish because I hate to start out with a shotgun when I think a pea shooter is going to solve it. And a lot of times I lose fish because I didn't start out with that shotgun. So it's a product of me learning. It's a product of of what's available to us in the hobby, what we have learned from other people, and it's always evolving, but it doesn't always break our habits. You know, uh, the the idea of Lucas's fish keeping method works really well for him because he's got hundreds of tanks. He couldn't possibly have a canister filter for every one of those tanks and not be charging us $200 a fish for whatever fish we buy because of the power bill, because of the massive amount of money he would be spending at canister companies and replacing canisters and replacing whatever kind of filtration he was using. So for him, that methodology really works. I've been out in the wild. I've caught fish in the wild, and I became even more aware that these fish in the wild are living in environments that have very few plants in them. Most 90% of the environments out there that fish come from have no living plants in their environment. They're living in deep lakes. They're living in mountain streams. They're living in fast flowing rivers. But the one thing that's common to a lot of these is splashing water. Water splashing on rocks, high evaporation because of the width of the river, because of the splashing that goes on when that heavy water flow, and some of them are really heavy water flow, like it's hard to stand in the flow. All that water flow hitting rocks creates all kinds of splashing and evaporation and a breaking down of carbon in the carbon dioxide and oxygen molecules. They get broken down by all of that heavy flow and splashing. So my learning, my habits that I developed, and I'm not for a second trying to say that my habits are perfect. They're not. It's just what I have developed over the years as what I think really works. Part of it is that I've never had a green thumb, so I don't really do very well growing plants. Now, my wife grows plants really well, so she uses a lot of plants in her tanks, where I don't use a lot of plants in mine. And I use a lot of splashing of water. For some reason, I have really developed the methodology of splashing water from canister outflows into the sides of tanks, not just into the water, but literally splashing them off of the side of the tank across from the outflow. I've developed a lot of ways in which there is a lot of cross currents smacking into each other that keep the detritus in the tank up and being pulled into canister intakes. And all of that creates a situation, in my mind, that is like the environments where I have found a lot of fish. That is not to say that there aren't many environments that are covered in plants underwater. That's not to say that there aren't many environments that are very stagnant. That's not to say that there aren't many environments that have deep pools of water in a flowing area where the more fragile and smaller fish can get out of the heavy flow and into these deep pools and exist without a lot of being buffeted around by water flow. But I continually find myself setting tanks up where there is a lot of heavy water flow, and it's because of my experience. So I'm loath to give up the things that I know that create that heavy water flow that I think is indicative of the wild environments where you're likely to catch these fish at. What environment are they living in? They're living in a low plant or no plant, heavy flow, and a lot of splashing environment where there's a lot of large rocks, where there may be a sand bottom, where there may be a gravel bottom. And so I try to recreate that in my tanks, and it's just what I do. It's the habits of the methodology that I've developed as a fish keeper. That's not to say that it's right. That's not to say that it's wrong. But I think all of us as fish keepers get faced with this exact issue over and over again every time we see a new methodology come out, every time someone tells us, oh, no, you're doing it wrong. You got to do it like this. This is what works. We are faced with that paradigm in our head of the methodology that we have made a habit in our fish keeping with what this new information is, or with what this new technology is. So that's kind of the topic that I wanted to reach into today.
So I have a question. So are you saying that whatever works for you is the right methodology?
No, I'm not saying that it's the right methodology. What I'm saying is that we all have reasons for developing the methodology that we use as fish keepers, and that it works for us, to a certain extent. And we develop habits. Those become habits in our fish keeping, and we have a hard time breaking out of those habits. It's hard to convince us to go to something new.
Okay.
Hey, Jack Welker, welcome to the stream. All right, guys. Nobody's asking me any questions because they've been listening to me rant and lecture and preach. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to wrap this thing up. We're closing in on the hour. I hope that some of my little rant about habits and methodologies and ways that we learn to keep fish that become comfortable for us as fish keepers, and that we are loath to let go of because some new technology has come in. All right, guys. Hey, I'm trying to sell a nice old antique World War II SS Nazi trench coat. It's a nice long leather trench coat. I'm trying to sell it for 75 bucks. Is that something you're interested in? And there's my answer. This is a fish keeping live stream, even if sometimes it may not seem like it exactly. All right, guys. On that note, I'm out of here. I hope something I've said gives you some help or causes you to think about things in a slightly different way, to recognize how your habits have developed, and maybe help you to get around the habits if the habits are causing you an issue. All right, you guys have a good rest of the weekend, and good luck with your fish.